Hi, I'm Delisa Renideo, and today I'm going to show you how to make a holiday roast. Now, a holiday roast is something like turkey without any meat, which sounds a little odd, but it's something that is a very special occasion type of food you can have for Thanksgiving or Christmas or anytime you want something special. It is in my book, The Barefoot Gardener and the Kitchen Cookbook, on page 109. And it has lots of good instructions for you so that you'll be able to make this when you follow the instructions. So what we do is use 4 blocks of tofu. And this is the regular tofu, not silken. And it doesn't have to be any special brand or anything. So I'm going to show you how I do this. First of all, if you haven't used this kind of tofu before, I need to show you that this is in a tub of water. So you have to, I already washed the surface so that I'm not introducing bacteria into here. I'm just going to dump the water out right now. There's quite a bit of water in each one. So that's the first thing. You just dump the water out. And of course, you just dump it into your drain. But since I am over here and not by my drain, I'm dumping it into a bowl. Now, when you use this tofu for this recipe, this is fresh tofu that has not been frozen. But this is a very magical kind of tofu that if you freeze it, then you can do some other wonderful things with it. But for this recipe, it has to be fresh tofu that has not been frozen. So let's get all of these drained. Okay, so I'm going to move this out of my way. Now we're going to mash the tofu in a bowl. And I'm just going to take one container at a time to mash it up. I'm just going to use a very antique masher. This is a potato masher. I think this is probably very old, maybe as old as I am. I inherited it from my mother, and she's been gone for almost 10 years. And she had it for a long time. So I'm just breaking it up into kind of big chunks right now. Dump another one in, break that up into big chunks. If you put it all in at once, it's kind of hard to press it down that much. So that's why I'm doing it just one at a time. Again, I'm just mashing it into big chunks first, and then I will get it really, really, really well mashed up. So when you make this holiday roast, you need to do it in 2 stages. And this is stage 1, obviously. And this is what, if this were for Thanksgiving, I would be doing this on the night before Thanksgiving. Okay, so now I'm going to set this one aside. And I'm going to use a different potato masher that has a little finer holes in it. And I'm going to get it mashed up pretty well. The goal is to get it completely mashed up without any chunks at all, not even small chunks. And so I'm going to do it like this for a while, and then I'm going to switch over to my hands because my hands are sensitive enough to be able to feel whether I have any little chunks or not. Now, if I were in a live cooking class, I would be wearing gloves. But since I'm not doing that, I'm doing this in my own home kitchen. I've just washed my hands before I started and will not wear gloves. Okay, now this is going to feel pretty cold on my hands. But here's the reason why you need to use your hands, whether you're wearing gloves or not. Because I don't know if you can see this from there, but right now it's kind of the texture of cottage cheese, and I don't want those chunks in it. I want it really, really small, because what happens is we're going to press this and it's going to become a loaf. And if there are any chunks, they won't meld in with the rest of the loaf, and they're going to act kind of like a splinter that you have in your hand, and they won't stay mixed in with the rest. So when I do this, I can feel as it goes through my fingers if there's sort of a chunk in it. Now this is kind of cold, so this is when you might really want to have some gloves on just to protect your hands from the cold. So I got it mashed up enough so that it will work in my roast. Now you might ask, why don't you just mash it up in a food processor if you want all the lumps out? Well, don't do that. Here's why. The food processor would make it more like a puree, and that is not the texture that you want. That would not work well. You wouldn't be able to do the pressing part that you need to be able to do. So you just mash it as well as you can with your hands, and now we're going to add the seasoning. So I'm going to look at my recipe, and it calls for 3 tablespoons of chickless seasoning mix, which is also in my cookbook. And so basically it's a mixture of different herbs and some nutritional yeast. And nutritional yeast is a wonderful, amazing, magical food that makes things taste richer and cheesier. But in this case, mixed with the herbs, it tastes kind of like chicken broth. So, and there's salt in it as well. So I'm going to put in 3 tablespoons of the seasoning. And then I'm putting in 3 teaspoons each of sage and thyme. And I need a spoon. So 3 teaspoons is a tablespoon. So I'm going to put in a tablespoon of the sage and a tablespoon of the thyme. And also 1½ teaspoons of black pepper. So this is going to be very close to exactly what I want, but I'm pretty particular and I want to have exactly what I want. And so the only way to know if it's exactly what I want is to taste it. Now, if you were making a turkey, cooking a turkey, you wouldn't be able to do this because you can't eat your raw meat. So I'm actually putting seasoning in a nice, healthy, safe plant food, and I can taste it. And that's one of the advantages of cooking plant-based, because you can pretty much always just sample the food that you're making and add more of this or that to it. So this started out looking pure white, but now it's got all kinds of little flecks from the seasoning, and you can smell it. Has that yummy kind of, I don't know, sort of like stuffing flavor smell. So I'm going to just sample a little of this and see if I want any more of those seasonings. Oh, it's just right. I love it, even without doing any more to it than this. So maybe you can see a close-up of what this looks like now. So as you see, it's got all these little flecks of all the seasoning. So now comes the next part, which is what makes it really different. We are going to press this into a colander. And then we're going to press it down and get all the extra liquid out. So I need to have some kind of fabric that I line this with, and this is going to be a little ironic. This is actually a stretchy fabric made from a game bag. And you could use cheesecloth, but you need the finest cheesecloth possible. You don't want any big holes in it, because otherwise this is going to press it right through here. So they do still, you can still buy these in these game bags at places like Cabela's or other outdoor stores, but you need the kind that is stretchy and fine. So you might have to kind of search for it. But once you get it, you don't ever have to buy it again. You just wash it and use it over and over. I've used this one many, many times. So it's important to have the right size colander. If it's too big and too wide and flat, you're not going to have the shape that you want for your roast. Scrape that all down in there. So I'm going to even this out, just kind of make it flat. And this is still very soft, as you can see, but it won't stay that way. As soon as I flatten it out, I'm going to bring the sides in to cover it up. And then you need to have some kind of a round plate to put on it that will just fit inside of here. And I used to just use a plate, like the kind you eat off of, but Charlie made me a round disc out of wood, and I'm just going to press that on there, and now we need some weight. Okay, here's a weight for you. I'm going to put this in a bowl because I want to catch the drips. And now this is my old jug that I've had for many, many years, and it's full of rocks. And it weighs about 15 pounds, I think. Feels pretty heavy. And it's going to sit on there like this for several hours. Actually, I just leave it overnight. And then tomorrow, which we will look at in a little bit, I'm going to take this all apart, and we're going to scoop out the center, put stuffing in it, and bake it. But for now, this is the whole job that we have to do today. If you don't have a jug of rocks, which you might not have right now, and after the snow all melts, be sure you collect some rocks and put them in a jug. In the meantime, just find something, whatever heavy thing you have. I need to leave this in a place that is cold, not too cold, but refrigerator temperature. So, because it's pretty tall, it's going to be difficult to put in your refrigerator. But if you happen to live in a place like Alaska, like I do, then I have places that I can put it. I can put it out in my garage. I have a cool room, kind of like a root cellar. If you can make room, oh, there's my cat. She wants me to say hi. You can make room on the shelf in your refrigerator and just make room for it. You'll need it for overnight, or I'd say a minimum of 5 hours. And then after that, you take it out of the refrigerator and come back to your work area. Well, hi, I'm back. It's the next day now. I'm sure you remember that last night after I pressed the tofu in here, I put this heavy jug on here, which is full of rocks, and I actually weighed it today. It's 14 pounds. So if you only had a jug of water, it'd be 8 pounds, so get some rocks. So I'm going to move this out of the way. And it's been sitting in a bowl so to catch the drips. I'm going to show you how much water came out of it. Look at that. That's almost 1.5 cups of water that came from those 4 pounds of tofu. So it's very compressed. And I'm going to show you all that in a little bit. But first I'm going to make the stuffing, and then I'm going to show you how we prepare the tofu roast in order to accept the stuffing. All right, so I am going to make the stuffing, which is also in the cookbook on page 109. And you can make stuffing your own way as long as you don't put any unhealthy ingredients in it. That's a big deal. So I'm using, of course, onions, lots of onions and celery. And I have some garlic already in here. I'm actually doubling my recipe because I like to have extra stuffing, so some of it will fit inside the roast and then I'll bake some in another pan. So I'm going to dump my onions in here, and you'll notice I did not put any oil or butter. And this, if you decide to use your own recipe, be sure you don't put butter in there. I can remember back in the olden days when I used to follow some other recipe, they'd literally call for like a whole cube of butter. Not a good idea. That would be 1,000 calories in 1 cube of butter. And the bad part about that is that those 1,000 calories are empty calories. Empty calories. Just like sugar is empty calories, oil is empty calories. So I didn't put anything in here with it. There's enough moisture in the vegetables that I don't need anything to keep them from burning unless I turn it up a little bit. And my solution is to keep things from burning, just to use a little bit of water. Now I'm not going to boil them. I'm going to show you. I just pour in a little, like that. And so if it starts to stick, starts to burn, all you need to do is add a little bit of water. That's called water sauteing. Clever, huh? And if you don't put any water in, which is what I often do, because if I just have it on a medium temperature, medium heat, then there's enough liquid in the vegetables themselves that it starts to come out just like it does with mushrooms. Speaking of mushrooms, I like to put mushrooms in my stuffing, so I'm going to just put them in right now. Whoa, it's going to take a little bit of time for all this stuff to cook down. And while we're at it, let's put in our celery. So this is going to take a little time to cook down. So I think what I will do is put the lid on and just check on it again in a little bit. So the other ingredients that I'm going to put in a little bit later is actually some raisins and some nuts. That's totally optional. But I like a little bit of sweet flavoring in there, and so that's what I use for sweetness. And I'm also going to use whole wheat bread cubes. Now I make my own whole wheat bread, and I had this already made in the freezer, and so I just cut it up. So again, I'm doubling this recipe, so I have quite a lot of bread. But this is, if you are making a bread stuffing, which, why not? Unless you want to use like something like brown rice stuffing or something like that. But if you're going to use bread, be sure you use a good quality bread. Don't just use some cheap bread like Wonder Bread or something. You want it to be a whole grain bread that's got lots of nutrients in it and fiber. So this is a good whole wheat bread. That's also in the cookbook, but you can also purchase a good quality whole wheat bread. And then we're going to add some seasonings to this. Some sage, thyme, rosemary, and sometimes I use celery seed, but today no celery seed because I didn't find any celery seed in my cupboard. And it's not something that I feel like is critically important. Now the thing about the seasonings, you really have to do it to taste. Now the cookbook of course gives you some starting points, but you're not going to know if it's just the right amount to suit your taste buds until you get everything mixed together and then taste it. So that's another good reason to be having a healthy plant-based recipe so that you don't have any like raw ingredients that might be bad for you that are in the animal kingdom. Okay, that's just starting to heat up now. Okay. So I'm going to measure out the amount of seasonings that I have in the cookbook, and then I'll decide whether I want to add more. I already know that it's not too much because I've made these before. You can probably guess that. Okay. Even though I'm going to feel totally free to change the amount that I want to use. I still use a measuring spoon and measure it out just so that I will know how much I'm putting in. I don't do that with everything, but this is something where I really want to have enough sage but not too much sage. So I'm going to put in some thyme. It says 1 to 2 teaspoons of thyme. So I think I will split the difference and put in 1.5 teaspoons per recipe. Again, I'm doubling the recipe. And then rosemary. Now you can get powdered rosemary, or this is rosemary that's crushed. And I don't really want any big pieces in here. There's a stick. Look at that. Okay, so I'm going to crush it more with my fingers. So and of course, if you get powdered, that's fine. And if you want to use fresh, all the better. You use 3 times as much if you're going to use fresh. That's kind of a rule of thumb, you know. Instead of 1 teaspoon, you would use 3 teaspoons. So this isn't going to be completely powdered, but it's broken up more than if I just put it in as is. Now everybody has really a very different set of preferences when it comes to how much flavor to put in, how much seasoning. So I really, really suggest that you, after you get some in and you get all the other ingredients in and it's all stirred up, and then you actually taste it. Okay, I'm going to toss this around and let's check on our vegetables. Starting to cook down a little bit. Now, of course, adding more vegetables is always a good idea in everything because vegetables are our most nutrient-dense foods. So putting lots of vegetables in adds a lot of flavor, lots of fiber, and lots of nutrients. And it'd be really boring if it was just bread. Again, I know some people make a cornbread stuffing, some people make a rice-based stuffing. If you're using rice, make sure it's brown rice and not white, because the white rice has had the fiber and most of the nutrients removed. Take a look at the roast, well, they call it basting mixture. I'm going to show you what it is. Here it is. So I've already mixed it up. So it has tahini, and tahini is just ground up sesame seeds. It's sesame seed butter. So like peanut butter, ground up peanuts. So tahini, low sodium soy sauce. It calls for miso, which is optional, and I did not put it in, and some orange juice and mustard. So I don't ever mix up my orange juice like a whole, pitcher full of orange juice. I just buy my concentrated orange juice, keep it in the freezer, and I'll just scoop out a little bit when I need to. So this 2 tablespoons of orange juice actually would be already diluted. And there's 1 part of the concentrate to 3 parts of water. So basically, I just put in a little bit of the concentrate and then some water to bring it up to that amount. And then I stirred this up, and this is what I'm going to baste our roast with. We're making progress here. Now you saw me put in a little bit of water, but there's more liquid in here now than I put in. And that's because it came out of the mushrooms and even the other vegetables. So that probably needs a couple more minutes. All right, so we've got our vegetables that are done. Finally, it took a long time to get the celery done. And I'm going to just dump those all in here. You see there's a lot of vegetables to go with that bread. Okay. Move that out of the way. Now I'm going to probably need to add a little bit of liquid to this. Whoops. And I will just, since I'm not using oil or butter, I'm just going to add water if I need to. So first I'm going to stir this all around and let that cool off a little bit so I don't burn myself when I start mixing it with my hands. Oh, that's nice. My fan just went off won't have to be noisy here. So the right amount of moisture in here is actually one of the things that's important when you're making stuffing. You don't want it too dry and just, taste dry. But you don't want it soggy either. So you kind of need to mix things around and then kind of squeeze it together to see if it'll hold together in a ball. I washed my hands. I'm ready to stick them in there, and I hope I'm not going to burn myself. Yeah, it's a little hot. Okay. Yeah, so even though I didn't add any water yet, there's enough moisture in these hot vegetables to actually probably be enough. I'm going to let this cool down, set it aside, and I'm going to change my work area, move things around so that we can get busy with the tofu now. All right, so now I'm going to take a look at my pressed tofu, and it's very much firmer than it was last night when I put it in here, because again, this much liquid came out of here. So I'm going to tip this up a little bit so you can see what it looks like. So now what I'm going to do, get this out of my way, I'm going to scoop out the center with a spoon. And I'm going to leave about an inch or maybe 3/4 of an inch around. So it's going to be like a bowl made of tofu. So I'm going to just take this out and put it over here. And we're going to use it again later. But we're scooping this out so that we have a bowl to put our stuffing in. And it's got all these speckles in it because those are the seasonings that I put in yesterday. So even though tofu itself basically doesn't have any taste at all, it takes on whatever taste, because it's so mild, it's really a convenient food to use for lots of different things because it is so mild that you can flavor it any way you want. So of course we've got these Thanksgiving type flavors in here. So I'm going to show you in a minute here what I've got. So we've got a bowl scooped out, but I can't really tell how thick the tofu is because I don't have x-ray vision, unfortunately. So I'm going to use a sharp knife and I'm going to just stick it down in there to test. Okay, I'm going to hold this up. That's only that deep at the bottom. So maybe a ½ inch. So I'm not going to take that down any further, but it's still pretty thick along the sides. And the other thing that I want to do is I want to raise the sides up so that I have room for more tofu. And if I just left it like this, I wouldn't be able to put much stuffing in it. I said tofu, right? I want to make room for stuffing. So now I'm going to press the sides up a little bit to raise it up rather than just scooping it all out. And it's not going to be totally even everywhere because I just can't tell what I'm doing. And I'm going to use some of this that I took out to build up the sides. Make my container bigger to hold more stuffing. I'm not going to use it all this way because I'm going to save some to put a lid on it, a tofu lid. so that it'll all stay enclosed. I saw this recipe, or almost this recipe, I've changed it of course, probably 20 years ago or something, and I've made this ever since, every year for Thanksgiving, and often for some other holiday like Christmas or Easter, and just when I feel like it. Because it isn't actually that hard to do, although when you're looking at the recipe and you look like, oh, look at all those steps, I don't know if I want to do that. I know that's my attitude when I see a recipe that has a lot of steps. Okay, so it's getting fuller. I'm just kind of pressing it down near the bottom to kind of pull it up and in to make it firm and tall. I'm going to try to make it as even as I can, but I can't really tell how even it is. I'm guessing. And guessing is good enough. Okay. So now, I want you to look in the bowl. You see it's way deeper than it was. It's going to hold twice as much stuffing as if I hadn't built up the sides. So now I'm going to set this aside for a minute, and we're going to finish working on the stuffing, and then we'll stuff it. So it's cooled off enough, I think, so I shouldn't be hurting myself when I touch it. I need to see how the moisture is. Pretty good, actually. I want it to be able to hold together if I squish it into a ball, kind of. So now I haven't added the nuts and the raisins yet, but I'm going to taste my stuffing to see whether I want to add some more seasonings to it before I add those other things. Yes, I do want to add some more. So I'm going to go rinse my hands off. I'll be right back. Okay, so I'm going to add another whole tablespoon of sage, because of course sage is the most important ingredient for tasting like Thanksgiving. And I'm just going to sprinkle in, see, I'm not going to measure. I said I measure. I measured the first part. I'm just sprinkling in a little bit of the thyme. And I'm going to crumble in a little bit more rosemary. Actually, I think in terms of the bread, I have more than doubled the recipe. And now I'm also going to add the raisins. Sometimes I add chopped fresh apples instead, and walnuts, because I like that crunch in there. So the walnuts are going to give it a whole food fat, a natural fat, as opposed to any kind of a processed oil. But it doesn't make the whole thing oily. Yet you're going to see when it's a completed roast that this is actually going to hold together very nicely. It doesn't need that oil in there. Not putting oil in the food is one of the hardest things for people to do. As I teach live cooking classes to groups all the time, and many times people say, I can give up the meat, but I just can't cook without oil. But then they do, and they're always amazed. That's one of the fun things about my classes for me, is getting to the point where people discover that you don't need oil. Okay, now we're getting there. I'm going to add just some water. I don't want it to get too soupy, but I also want to make sure it sticks together well. So I'm going to give it a little squeeze and see if it feels right. And hopefully I can show you why I think it does feel right. Yes, it feels right. You see there, I've got a nice glob that holds together. So here's what we do now. I fill up my tofu bowl, and here's where it's really hard not to press it down. If you press it down too much, then it's going to expand as it cooks, and it's going to crack your roast. And you don't want a cracked roast if you don't have to have a cracked roast. So all of the rest of this, there's a lot left, is going to go in another pan. But you can see I've filled it up pretty much. And now I'm going to just put this on the top. Cover it. So all that yummy stuffing is completely enclosed. And you're going, that doesn't look very good. Wait till you see it in a couple of hours. It's going to be amazing. And I really wish you could smell it, because it's going to even smell more amazing. Okay, so now I'm going to show you the next little trick. Move this out of the way. Oh, I'm going to turn on my oven to 350. So now what we're going to do is turn this over onto a cookie sheet that has parchment paper on it. So I'm going to lay this on here like this, and I'm going to try to make sure that all the cloth, the stretchy cloth, is pulled out. Okay, here we go. Flip it over. Very slippery with that paper on it. Pull that off and pull off our cloth. Ta-da! Wasn't that cute? Oh, look at that. A perfect little bowl of tofu roast full of yummy seasoned stuffing. So now, of course, I'm going to baste it, and then we're going to put it in the oven. Let me explain why I have tahini in here. The original recipe called for sesame oil, and sesame oil tastes delicious, but I don't use any processed oils, not even sesame oil, but I use tahini because tahini is made from sesame seeds. And so I wanted that little bit of fat in there and the flavor of it. So now I'm going to just baste this on. I actually cut the basting recipe in half because a lot of times I end up doing 2 roasts at a time. And I'm only doing this one this time. Okay, so now I'm going to bake this for an hour with a cover on it. And I'm going to cover it with foil. Let me move this out of my way. I'll move this out of my way. Okay, I'm going to show you a trick that I learned from one of my wonderful students. Her name was Fran, and she showed me how to cover my roast without it touching. Now, you don't want aluminum foil to touch your food. I know a lot of people wrap their potatoes and they have their foil touching their food. You don't want your foil to touch your food because it's aluminum. And aluminum gets absorbed into our body and it's not a good thing. We know that it does bad things to our brain and probably other parts of us too. But let me show you the trick that I learned from Fran. So first you have to have some really sturdy foil. You can't have just a little wimpy everyday foil. And it needs to be a pretty big sheet. Now I've used this one before. I don't like to waste things. So it started flat and then you wrap it around a bowl and press it down and scrunch it in. And it's great because now you've got this little bowl-shaped cover. You have to make sure it's the right size to cover what you're putting on there. But now look at that. It's going to hold itself up so that I don't have to worry about it, you know, falling down or something. I used to try and tuck it around the edges, and so Fran saw my problem and she showed me, and I love it when I learn tips like this from other people. So now I'm going to put this in the oven for an hour. I wish you could smell it. Okay, you see how this little cap stayed very nicely on there? And see how all the light, it turned light again because the marinade soaked into it. And the reason why it's starting to get a little bit darker at the bottom is just because the hot air could get in under there better. So I'm going to baste it again and put it back in the oven. We'll put this back in the oven without the cover over it this time. And in 15 minutes, we'll take it out and do it again. And it's starting to brown a little bit more. Probably one more time of basting and roasting might be enough. See how golden brown it's getting already? Okay, it goes back in the oven. Ta-da! It's a nice golden brown color. If you want it darker, you can leave it in longer, but I think it's ready. So now I'm going to show you how I get this off of here and onto a serving plate. So the first thing is actually pretty easy. If you have the parchment paper here, you can just slide this out like that. That part's really easy. But now comes the trickier part. I mean, it doesn't hurt anything if you let it cool for a little bit, but I'm going to see if I can do this. So what I'm going to do is put I'm going to slide this over onto the plate, and then I'm going to try to slide the paper out from under it. Okay, so far so good. Sometimes I get a little help at this point, but you might not need it. So I'm going to just make sure it's not crusty and tight right underneath there. Okay, now I'm going to slide my spatula underneath, and I'm going to slide another spatula underneath. I think it's going to work. If you have another person in the house who's not working the camera, you can get a little bit more help. But look at that, it's working. Yippee! All right, I didn't even crack it this time. I do want to center it a little bit more. It takes a pretty big platter, not just a regular dinner plate size platter. And if I'm not going to cut it right away and serve it, I am going to cut this one right away and serve it. But if I'm not going to, and I'm taking it, for instance, to a group meal, dinner, then I decorate all around here with little sprigs of parsley and radish roses all the way around. And if you look in the cookbook, you'll see a picture of that. But I'm not going to do that here. I'm actually going to cut this and put some on a plate. A thin knife, this is actually my bread knife, and I'm going to cut it all the way across. And I get 16 pretty generous servings out of this. So I cut it in half one way, and then I cut it in half the other way. Let's see, is that about right? That's about right. And then you cut each one of those quarters into quarters, and then it works. Okay, wish me luck. If I let it cool a little bit, like I said, it would be easier. But, and you know how the first one out is always the worst one? Let's hope it's not. Here it comes. Oh, yep, I lost some stuffing. Okay. Here it comes. Nice, moist stuffing. Now the second one out is going to be a lot easier, as you can imagine, because what I'll do is I'll just hold my spatula up against there, but I wanted you to see the way this looks. We've got our tofu around the outside and our stuffing in the middle. And right here, this is pretty thick. If I could have had x-ray vision, I would have made this a little bit thinner here, but it won't be the same all the way around. So I'm going to serve everything else that we're having with this meal. And the next time you see me, you'll see the plate all loaded with all the other goodies. Well, here's my delicious holiday meal. So of course I have my holiday roast with stuffing, and you can't see it very well now because it's covered up with my mushroom gravy, which is yummy, and mashed potatoes with my gravy on it. And the yellow color in the mashed potatoes is because my potatoes are really yellow. They're Magic Myrnas, which I grew in my garden, and you don't have to use those. Any kind of golden kind of potato. If you're brave, you can use all blue potatoes. And we have, of course, steamed broccoli and yams. And this is cranberry relish. Isn't it beautiful? Look at that beautiful color. And that doesn't have any sugar in it. But don't worry, it's still sweet. It's made with, it's sweetened with grapes. And it also has some apples and oranges in it. And then, of course, I have my delicious salad. I love my salad with every meal, and it's topped with my sauerkraut that I make, red sauerkraut. So I'm ready to sample it now. Yum. No reason to wait till Thanksgiving to make this, you guys. Yum. And actually, I love it with a little bite of cranberries with it. That's even better. Unbelievable. It wasn't really hard. Didn't you think that was pretty easy? Hope you'll make it yourself.